On the morning of April 6, 1862, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman was having breakfast in his tent near a small log church in southwestern Tennessee. The air smelled of coffee and bacon. His men were relaxed, some still in their bedrolls. They'd been camped here at Pittsburgh Landing for 2 weeks, waiting for reinforcements. No one had bothered to dig trenches. Why would they? The enemy was 20 miles away in Corinth, Mississippi. Then, at exactly 5:14 a.m., a wall of Confederate soldiers emerged from the morning mist. Within minutes, Sherman's camps were overrun. Men died with coffee cups still in their hands. Tents collapsed onto sleeping soldiers. Horses screamed and bolted through the chaos. Sherman himself had his hand grazed by a bullet as he shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar of Usk Wood. By noon, the Union Army was pressed against the Tennessee River with nowhere to retreat. By evening, their commanding general, Ulysses S. Grant, was preparing for what he believed would be his final stand. This is the story of Shiloh, a battle that would produce more casualties in 2 days than all previous American wars combined. A battle where tactical brilliance met catastrophic failure, where the fate of the Western theater, and perhaps the entire Civil War, hung by a thread. And it all began because nobody believed the Confederates would dare attack. To understand how the Union Army found itself on the edge of annihilation at Shiloh, we need to rewind 3 months to February 1862. The war was 10 months old, and the North was hungry for victories. The Eastern Theater had delivered nothing but humiliation. Bull Run still haunted the public consciousness. But out west, a relatively unknown general named Ulysses S. Grant was about to change the narrative. Fort Henry fell on February 6th. Fort Donelson surrendered 10 days later. Grant's demand for unconditional surrender, his initials, U.S., suddenly stood for something, made him an overnight sensation. Newspapers called him the hero of Donelson. Lincoln finally had a general who fought. But these victories weren't just about morale. They opened the Tennessee River, a natural highway that drove like a dagger into the heart of the Confederacy. Control the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, and you controlled Kentucky and western Tennessee. Control those, and you split the Confederate West from its eastern heartland. The strategic prize was a dusty railroad junction in northern Mississippi called Corinth. 2 critical rail lines intersected there: the Memphis and Charleston Railroad running east-west, and the Mobile and Ohio running north-south. Whoever held Corinth controlled the logistics of the entire region. Supplies, reinforcements, communication. Everything flowed through Corinth. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston understood this perfectly. Johnston was Jefferson Davis's favorite general. Many considered him the South's finest military mind. Tall, commanding, with steel-gray eyes and an unshakable belief in the offensive, Johnston had evacuated Nashville and fallen back to Corinth to consolidate his scattered forces. His plan was simple and audacious: strike Grant before Union reinforcements arrived, destroy his army, and retake the initiative in the West. Meanwhile, Grant's Army of the Tennessee, roughly 40,000 men, was encamped at Pittsburgh, landing on the western bank of the Tennessee River. The location seemed ideal. The riverbank rose in steep bluffs about 100 feet high, creating a natural defensive barrier at their backs. The landing itself provided easy access for steamboats bringing supplies, and eventually, the Army of the Ohio under General Don Carlos Buell, another 35,000 men marching overland from Nashville. Grant made a critical assumption: Johnston wouldn't attack. Why would he? Confederate forces were disorganized, demoralized from the loss of Forts Henry and Donelson. Conventional wisdom said Johnston would defend Corinth, not abandon it to strike north. Grant's superior, General Henry Halleck, shared this view. So did Sherman, whose division was camped closest to the Confederate line. This assumption led to a fatal complacency. Grant didn't order entrenchments. His men didn't dig rifle pits or build abattis barriers made from sharpened tree branches. Standard military practice in 1862 dictated that armies fortify their positions, especially when in enemy territory. Grant later admitted in his memoirs that this was a mistake, but at the time, he believed an attack was impossible. The terrain around Pittsburgh Landing should have worried him more than it did. The area was heavily forested with oak, hickory, and dense undergrowth. Visibility rarely extended beyond 100 yards. Three creeks, Snake Creek to the north, Lick Creek to the south, and Owl Creek to the west, created natural boundaries that would channel any assault into predictable corridors. But those same creeks could trap an army against the river if things went wrong. Grant's 6 divisions were spread across this landscape without any coherent defensive line. Sherman's division held the right flank near a small Methodist meeting house called Shiloh Church. The name meant place of peace in Hebrew. Benjamin Prentice's division, composed largely of green recruits who'd been in service less than a month, held the left center. John McClernand, Stephen Hurlbut, and W. Hell Wallace filled the gaps. General Lew Wallace's division was stationed 6 miles north at Crump's Landing, positioned to block any Confederate movement from that direction. Grant himself wasn't even at Pittsburgh Landing. He'd established his headquarters 9 miles downriver in Savannah, Tennessee, waiting for Buell's army to arrive. Grant's ankle was badly swollen. His horse had slipped on wet ground a few days earlier, and he was hobbling around on crutches. He planned to visit the camps daily but saw no urgency. The enemy was at Corinth, 23 miles away, except they weren't. On April 3rd, Johnston began moving his entire army north from Corinth. He'd assembled 44,000 men, organized into 4 corps under Generals Leonidas Polk, Braxton Bragg, William Hardee, and John Breckinridge. The Confederate plan called for a surprise attack that would hit Grant's left flank, driving the Union Army away from Pittsburgh Landing and trapping them against the swamps of Snake Creek. It was an excellent plan on paper. The execution was chaos. Johnston had ordered his corps to march on parallel roads to speed the advance. Instead, units got tangled. Hardee's corps blocked Bragg's. Supply wagons clogged intersections. What should have taken 1 day stretched to 3. Worse, discipline broke down. Confederate soldiers fired their weapons to check if the powder was dry. Officers let their men shout and sing. Drums beat unnecessarily. The element of surprise seemed hopelessly compromised. General P.G.T. Beauregard, Johnston's second in command and the hero of Fort Sumter and First Bull Run, argued for calling off the attack. "The enemy is undoubtedly prepared," he insisted. "We've lost surprise. We should return to Corinth." Johnston refused. "I would fight them if they were 1,000,000, he reportedly said. "They can present no greater front between these 2 creeks than we can, and the more men they crowd in there, the worse we can make it for them." On the night of April 5th, 44,000 Confederate soldiers slept in battle formation less than 2 miles from Union picket lines. Some Union sentries heard noises, the clank of equipment, the low murmur of thousands of men settling in, but their officers dismissed the reports. Sherman personally investigated one alarm and concluded it was a false alert. "Take your damn regiment back to Ohio," he told the colonel who'd reported enemy movement. There is no enemy closer than Corinth. He was catastrophically wrong. Major James Powell led a 3-company reconnaissance patrol out from Union lines just before dawn on April 6th. His orders were routine: scout toward the Corinth Road, check for Confederate activity, return before breakfast. Powell's men moved through the pre-dawn darkness, past Fraley's cotton field, into the dense woods beyond Dot at 5:14 a.m. Powell's advance guard collided with Confederate pickets from Hardee's corps. The first shots of Shiloh rang out. Within seconds, the skirmish escalated. Powell sent a rider galloping back to camp with a desperate message: "The enemy is advancing in force." But the warning came too late. Hardee's entire corps, nearly 9,000 men in 3 battle lines, emerged from the tree line, screaming the rebel yell. The sound was terrifying, a high-pitched, wavering shriek that Union soldiers who survived Shiloh would remember for the rest of their lives. One later wrote, "It was like all the demons from hell had been turned loose at once." Prentice's division took the first blow. Most of his men were still in their tents. Some were cooking breakfast. Others were washing at nearby streams. The division had been at Pittsburgh Landing for less than a week. Many soldiers had never heard a shot fired in anger. Now they were under assault from an enemy they didn't know existed. Chaos doesn't adequately describe what happened next. Entire companies disintegrated. Men ran in every direction. Officers tried to form defensive lines, but couldn't make themselves heard over the roar of musketry. Tents collapsed. Horses broke free from their picket lines. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the smell of burning canvas and wood as campfires were kicked over. Prentice managed to organize a fighting retreat through Reefield and Spainfield. But his division was being shredded. Confederate artillery, 6-pounder smoothbore cannons firing canister shot, turned the fields into killing zones. Canister was essentially a giant shotgun shell packed with iron balls. At close range, a single discharge could cut down a dozen men. Sherman's division, camped near Shiloh Church, fared slightly better. Sherman had 5 brigades spread across a mile-long front, and unlike Prentice, he had veterans from the Fort Donelson campaign. When Hardee's assault hit his camps, Sherman was already mounted and shouting orders. The fighting around Shiloh Church became desperate. Colonel Jesse Hildebrand's brigade held for nearly 40 minutes against repeated Confederate charges. Sherman was everywhere, rallying troops, directing artillery, personally leading counterattacks. A bullet grazed his hand. Another killed his orderly. A third struck his horse. Sherman simply mounted another horse and kept fighting, but numbers and momentum favored the Confederates. By 7 a.m., Sherman's forward camps had fallen. His men retreated to a second line near the Hamburg-Purdy Road. Confederate soldiers swarmed through the captured tents, looting food, weapons, and personal belongings. Some stopped to eat the breakfasts Union soldiers had abandoned. Others marveled at the abundance of supplies: coffee, sugar, preserved fruit. The Confederate Army was perpetually short on rations. One soldier later wrote, "I saw for the first time that our enemy lived better than we did." This looting, though understandable given Confederate deprivation, cost Johnston precious time. Officers struggled to maintain formation as their men scattered through the camps. What should have been a coordinated assault became a series of disorganized rushes. Meanwhile, Grant was 9 miles away in Savannah, Tennessee, sitting down to breakfast when he heard the distant rumble of artillery. He recognized it immediately, not the sporadic fire of skirmishers, but sustained bombardment. A battle. Grant abandoned his breakfast and limped down to the riverbank where the steamboat Tigress was docked. "Get up steam immediately," he ordered. "We're going to Pittsburgh Landing." Despite his injured ankle, Grant refused crutches. He couldn't appear weak, not now. The journey upriver took 90 agonizing minutes. Grant stood at the rail, listening to the battle intensify. The sound of tens of thousands of rifles created a continuous roar, like sustained thunder. Grant later wrote, "I knew my men were fighting for their lives." At 8:30 a.m., the Tigress pulled into Pittsburgh Landing. The scene that greeted Grant was pandemonium. Thousands of Union soldiers, perhaps 10,000 or more, had fled the fighting and were huddled under the high riverbank, too terrified to return to their units. Grant ordered provost guards to stop the retreat and turn men around. But it was like trying to dam a river with sandbags. Grant found Sherman near the Purdy Road. Sherman's uniform was spattered with blood, none of it his own. His hand was wrapped in a bloody handkerchief. "We're holding," Sherman reported, "but barely. They hit us with everything." "Where's Prentice?" Grant asked. falling back. His division's been mauled. Grant surveyed the situation. The Union line was bending but not breaking. The key was to buy time. Every hour they held increased the chance of Buell's army arriving from the east. Fill every gap, Grant ordered. Bring up every regiment you can find. We hold until Buell gets here. No retreat. By 9 a.m., the battle had expanded across a 3-mile front. The Confederate assault wasn't a coordinated attack. Johnston's carefully planned formation had broken down in the dense woods. Instead of sweeping the Union left and driving them away from the landing, Confederate corps were attacking wherever they encountered resistance. Hardee's corps intermingled with Bragg's. Polk's men got tangled with Breckinridge's. Unit cohesion dissolved in the smoke and confusion. But the Confederates had one critical advantage: momentum. They'd achieved complete surprise and were pushing the Union army steadily backward. Camps fell one after another. Shiloh Church, the Hamburg-Purdy Road, the Corinth Road, each position marked another step closer to the Tennessee River. If the Confederates could maintain pressure, if they could keep the Union forces reeling, they might achieve Johnston's objective: destroy Grant's army before Buell arrived. Around 9 a.m., something unexpected happened. The Confederate juggernaut, which had been rolling through Union positions like an avalanche, slammed into an immovable object, General Benjamin Prentiss, whose division had been scattered in the initial assault, had rallied approximately 4,500 men from various units along an old farm road that ran northeast to southwest through the middle of the battlefield. This road had been worn down by decades of wagon traffic until it sat 2 to 3 feet below the surrounding ground level. Natural trench. The position ran for about half a mile through thick oak forest. Underbrush provided additional cover. The ground to the front sloped slightly downward, giving Prentiss's men a clear field of fire. Behind them, other Union units were forming a defensive line. But Prentiss's position, soon to be known as the Hornet's Nest, became the anchor of the entire Union defense. Prentiss gave simple orders: hold this ground at all costs. The first Confederate assault came from Bragg's corps around 9:30. Louisiana and Arkansas's regiments advanced in parade ground formation lines of men shoulder to shoulder, rifles at port arms, officers on horseback. It was the standard Napoleonic tactic: close ranks, advance under fire, deliver a devastating volley at close range, then charge with bayonets. Prentiss's men waited until the Confederates were 50 yards away, then opened fire. The result was slaughter. Rifled muskets, particularly the .58 caliber Springfield and the Enfield, were accurate to 300 yards. At 50 yards, they couldn't miss. The Confederate front rank seemed to collapse all at once. Men fell in heaps. Officers toppled from horses. The survivors broke and ran. Bragg reformed his brigades and attacked again. Same result. And again. Each assault followed the same pattern: Confederate troops advancing bravely across open ground, Union rifles cutting them down, retreat in disorder. One Confederate colonel later wrote, "I never saw anything like it. The ground was carpeted with our dead and wounded. The noise was indescribable, like being inside a beehive made of hornets." That description gave the position its name, the Hornet's Nest. By 11 a.m., Bragg had thrown 6 separate assaults against the position, each one repulsed with heavy casualties. Other Confederate commanders tried different approaches. Polk attacked from the northwest. Hardee probed the northeastern flank. Breckinridge tried to outflank from the south. Nothing worked. The sunken road provided too much protection, and Prentiss's men, many of them green recruits who'd never fired a weapon in combat, fought with desperate courage. They knew if they broke, the entire Union center would collapse. Meanwhile, Confederate commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Johnston's plan had called for a rapid advance, that would roll up the Union flank and drive them into the swamps. Instead, the entire Confederate army was being sucked into a head-on assault against a fortified position. Units were arriving piecemeal, throwing themselves against the Hornet's nest without coordination. Johnston himself rode to the front around 1:30 p.m. He'd been directing the assault on the Union right flank. Near the Peach Orchard, a 10-acre field of peach trees in full bloom. The fighting there had been equally brutal, with neither side gaining advantage. Johnston believed one more push would break the Union line. He personally led a charge by the 5th, 10th Arkansas and 2nd Texas regiments against Union positions near the Peach Orchard. His presence inspired his men. The Confederates surged forward, driving the Union defenders back through the blooming trees. Then Johnston slumped in his saddle. Tennessee Governor Isham Harris, who'd been riding beside Johnston as a volunteer aide, caught him. "General, are you wounded?" Johnston's face was pale. "Yes," he said quietly, "and I fear seriously." A bullet, probably a mini-ball from a Union rifle, had struck Johnston behind his right knee, severing the popliteal artery. It was a wound that could have been easily treated with a tourniquet, but Johnston's personal physician had been sent to care for wounded Union prisoners. Johnston bled to death in minutes. Harris lowered the general's body to the ground beneath a tree. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Albert Sidney Johnston, the man Jefferson Davis called the greatest soldier in the Confederacy, died on a battlefield he'd expected to be his greatest triumph. Command passed to Beauregard, who was with the reserve forces near Shiloh Church. By the time word reached him and he moved forward to take command, precious hours had been lost. More critically, the Confederate assault lost its driving force. Johnston had been everywhere on the battlefield, personally directing attacks, rallying troops, making instant decisions. Beauregard was a talented strategist but not a field commander. He preferred to direct from headquarters. Beauregard made a tactical decision: concentrate everything against the Hornet's nest. If that position fell, the entire Union line would crumble. He ordered every available artillery piece brought forward. Confederate gunners manhandled 62 cannons, an unprecedented concentration of firepower in the positions surrounding the sunken road. The guns included 6-pounder and 12-pounder smoothbores, 10-pounder and 20-pounder Parrott rifles, and even a few captured Union pieces. At 3 p.m., all 62 guns opened fire simultaneously. The bombardment was unlike anything anyone on either side had experienced. Shells screamed overhead. Solid shots smashed into trees, sending splinters flying like daggers. Canister shot, essentially massive shotgun blasts, scythed through the brush. The noise was beyond description. Men couldn't hear their own officers shouting orders from 3 feet away. The barrage continued for 90 minutes. Union soldiers pressed themselves into the sunken road, trying to make themselves as small as possible. Many covered their ears and screamed, though no one could hear them. The wounded, and there were hundreds, lay helpless as shells exploded around them, but the sunken road's depth saved many lives. Artillery fire that would have decimated troops in the open passed overhead or buried itself in the embankment. Prentice's men endured. At 4:30 p.m., Beauregard ordered a coordinated infantry assault from 3 directions simultaneously. This time, the Confederate attack was better organized. Brigades advanced in multiple lines, maintaining formation despite casualties. The Union position began to buckle. Ammunition was running low. Many soldiers had been fighting for 11 hours straight. Casualties were mounting. Dead and wounded lay 3 deep in some sections of the road. Still, Prentice refused to withdraw. By 5 p.m., the situation was hopeless. Confederate forces had worked around both flanks. Prentice's division was surrounded. Escape routes were cut off. Union forces on either side of the Hornet's nest had already fallen back to new positions, closer to Pittsburgh Landing. At 5:30 p.m., With Confederate soldiers literally climbing into the sunken road from both ends, Prentiss accepted reality. He raised a white handkerchief and surrendered. Approximately 2,200 Union soldiers laid down their weapons and became prisoners of war. Confederate troops who'd been trying to kill these men minutes earlier now helped wounded Union soldiers to their feet. One Confederate captain later wrote, "I've never seen braver men. They fought like lions until they had nothing left to fight with." The fall of the Hornet's nest opened a gap in the Union center. Confederate forces poured through, advancing toward Pittsburgh Landing. Victory seemed within reach, but Prentiss's stand had cost the Confederates 7 crucial hours. 7 hours when Grant was organizing a new defensive line. 7 hours when Buell's army was marching closer. 7 hours that would decide the battle. By 6 p.m. on April 6th, the Union Army was in desperate straits. Grant's 6 divisions had been compressed into a semicircular defensive position less than a mile wide. Anchored on Pittsburgh Landing, with their backs to the Tennessee River, there was nowhere left to retreat. The bluffs at Pittsburgh Landing rose nearly 100 feet above the water. The landing itself, a natural shelf carved out by centuries of river flooding, was choked with humanity. Wounded men covered every available space. Ambulance wagons formed a chaotic tangle. Supply wagons that had been hauled up from the riverboats now blocked movement. And everywhere, thousands of demoralized soldiers who'd fled the fighting huddled under the bluff. Refusing to return to their units. Grant established his final defensive line about 500 yards inland from the landing. The position followed the natural contours of the terrain, a series of ravines and ridges that provided some cover. Sherman held the right flank near Snake Creek, McClernand, and Hurlbut formed the CENT-RWHL, Wallace's division. What remained of it after absorbing the retreating remnants of Prentiss's command held the left. Grant's ace in the hole was artillery. Over the course of the afternoon, he'd concentrated approximately 50 guns, every cannon that could be brought forward, along this final line. The artillerists had excellent fields of fire down the slopes leading to the landing. Any Confederate assault would have to advance uphill under direct cannon fire. Additionally, 2 Union gunboats, the USS Tyler and USS Lexington, had steamed upriver and positioned themselves off the landing. Each ship mounted 8 heavy naval guns. Though these weapons were designed for ship-to-ship combat, they could fire explosive shells in high arcs, like primitive howitzers. Beauregard now faced a critical decision. His army had driven the Union forces to the brink of destruction. One more push might finish them. But his men had been fighting since dawn. 14 hours of continuous combat. Casualties were staggering. Units were disorganized and intermingled. Ammunition was running low. Many soldiers had stopped to loot Union camps and were now scattered across the battlefield. Moreover, darkness was approaching. Night battles in the Civil War were extremely rare because of the difficulty of maintaining unit cohesion. In dense woods, in darkness, with thousands of armed men moving in different directions, the risk of friendly fire incidents was enormous. Beauregard consulted his corps commanders. The consensus was to halt for the night, reorganize, and resume the attack at dawn. Beauregard sent a telegram to Jefferson Davis in Richmond. "We have won a decisive victory. The enemy is retreating toward the river. We'll complete the victory tomorrow." It was one of the great miscalculations of the war. What Beauregard didn't know, what he had no way of knowing because Confederate scouts failed to report it, was that Buell's army of the Ohio was arriving on the opposite bank of the Tennessee River. The lead elements of Buell's command, General William Bull Nelson's division, had marched into view around 5 p.m. Nelson's troops were fresh, well-supplied, and eager for action. They'd been marching for days, hearing the sounds of battle grow louder. Knowing their comrades were fighting for survival, now began one of the most critical logistics operations of the war. The Tennessee River at Pittsburgh Landing was roughly half a mile wide. The Union had exactly 2 steamboats capable of ferrying troops across, the small side-wheeler that normally shuttled supplies, and a slightly larger vessel that Grant commandeered from a local merchant. Each trip took approximately 30 minutes, 15 minutes to cross loaded with troops, 15 minutes to return empty. Each boat could carry about 400 men per trip. Nelson had nearly 6,000 soldiers who needed to cross before they could reinforce Grant. The ferrying operation continued through the night. While the boats shuttled back and forth, Union engineers constructed a makeshift bridge using a partially sunken barge as a foundation. Planks were laid across it, creating a narrow footbridge that infantrymen could cross single-file. By midnight, approximately 7,500 of Buell's troops had crossed. More were still coming. Meanwhile, the night of April 6th was miserable for everyone on the battlefield. A cold rain began falling around 8 p.m., soaking both armies. Temperatures dropped into the low 40s. Thousands of wounded men lay scattered across miles of forest, crying for water, for help, for their mothers. The medical situation was catastrophic. Union field hospitals, mostly just canvas tents set up near the landing, were overwhelmed. Doctors worked by lantern light, performing amputations, extracting bullets, trying to stop bleeding. Anesthesia was in short supply. Many men underwent surgery with nothing but whiskey to dull the pain. Estimates suggest approximately 16,000 men from both sides were wounded on April 6th. The medical corps of both armies combined numbered fewer than 200 doctors. The math was simple and terrible. Most wounded men would receive no treatment until the next day, if then. Adding to the nightmarish atmosphere, the Union gunboats Tyler and Lexington began firing into the Confederate lines around 9 p.m. every 15 minutes. They launched massive explosive shells that arced through the darkness and detonated in the woods where Confederate troops were trying to rest. The shells didn't cause many casualties in darkness. Aimed fire was impossible, but they made sleep impossible. One Confederate soldier later wrote, "That was the longest night of my life. Cold rain, shells exploding every few minutes, the screams of wounded men all around us. We sat there in the mud, shivering, knowing we'd have to fight again come morning." Grant spent the night hobbling through the Union lines, checking positions, conferring with officers, projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. His injured ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. He was soaked to the skin, but he refused to rest. Around midnight, Sherman found Grant standing under a tree, rain dripping from his hat brim, smoking a cigar. Sherman was about to suggest they discuss evacuation plans, loading the army onto steamboats and retreating upriver. Before Sherman could speak, Grant said, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" "Yes," Sherman replied. "Lick 'em tomorrow, though." Grant looked at him with those unreadable eyes and said simply, "Lick 'em tomorrow." That brief exchange summed up Grant's character. No excuses, no recriminations, no consideration of retreat. Just a simple determination to finish what they'd started. By 3 a.m., Buell's entire lead division had crossed the river, approximately 18,000 fresh troops. More were crossing every hour. The reinforcements changed everything. What had been a desperate defensive struggle was about to become a counteroffensive. Dawn on April 7th broke gray and cold. The rain had stopped, but the battlefield was shrouded in fog that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards. Water dripped from trees. Smoke from thousands of campfires mixed with the fog, creating an eerie atmosphere. Confederate soldiers woke to a cold breakfast, if they had anything to eat at all. Many units had exhausted their rations. They'd been expecting to capture Union supplies, but Grant's defensive stand had prevented that. Now they were hungry, exhausted, and wet. Worse, Confederate commanders were discovering the true scale of their casualties. Johnston was dead. Over 8,000 men were killed or wounded, nearly 20% of the army. The units that had led the initial assault on April 6th were so depleted they could barely form coherent battle lines. Beauregard should have withdrawn. Any objective assessment of the situation would have concluded that the Confederate Army was in no condition to resume offensive operations. But Beauregard believed the Union forces were equally shattered. He expected them to retreat or surrender. The idea that Grant might attack never seriously occurred to him. That was his second critical mistake. At 5 a.m., Union forces advanced on a 3-mile front. The attack was methodical and overwhelming. On the right, Sherman and McClernand pushed forward with Buell's fresh divisions in support. In the center, Hurlbut advanced with renewed vigor. On the left, Nelson's division, the troops who'd crossed during the night, hit the Confederate flank with the fury of men eager to avenge their comrades. The Confederates fought back desperately. These were the same men who'd driven the Union Army to the brink of destruction the previous day. They knew how to fight. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. The first major engagement occurred around Water Oaks Pond, a small body of water in thick woods about a mile from Pittsburgh Landing. Confederate General James Chalmers positioned his brigade in a strong defensive position along a ridge overlooking the pond. Nelson's division attacked uphill through the fog. The fighting was brutal and personal. Visibility was so poor that soldiers often didn't see their enemies until they were within bayonet range. Regiments collided in the fog, firing blind, grappling hand to hand. The pond itself became a nightmare. Wounded men fell into the shallow water and drowned because they were too weak to stand. The battle for Water Oaks Pond raged for 3 hours. Chalmers's men repulsed 2 assaults, but the third broke through. Union forces flanked the position, and Chalmers was forced to withdraw. The Confederates had lost their first major defensive position. By 9 a.m., the fog had burned off, revealing the full scale of the Union offensive. Sherman was recapturing the camps near Shiloh Church. McClernand was pushing through Jones Field, a clearing that had seen savage fighting the previous day and was now littered with bodies. Hurlbut was advancing along the Hamburg-Purdy Road. Beauregard pulled his forces back to a new defensive line, centered on Shiloh Church and the Peach Orchard. These positions had natural advantages: clear fields of fire, elevated ground, but they required coordination to defend properly. Confederate units were so disorganized that effective coordination was impossible. The fighting around Shiloh Church became the focal point of the battle. The small log meeting house, barely 20 feet square, stood at the junction of several roads. Whoever controlled it controlled movement across the battlefield. Confederate artillery had been positioned in a semicircle around the church, and Union forces had to advance across open ground to reach it. Sherman personally led the assault. His horse was shot out from under him, his third horse killed in 2 days, but he mounted another and kept going. Union artillery blasted the Confederate positions with canister and solid shot. Infantry advanced in waves, taking heavy casualties but never stopping. One Union lieutenant later described the scene. The air was so thick with bullets you could practically feel them. Men fell with every step, but we kept going. Sherman was up front, waving his hat, shouting, "Come on, boys. We've got them now." How could we turn back when he was like that? By 11 a.m., Shiloh Church was in Union hands. The Peach Orchard, where Johnston had fallen the previous day, became the Confederates' last major defensive position. Beauregard threw everything he had left into holding it. Polk's corps, Breckinridge's division, and remnants of Hardee's command formed 3 defensive lines among the blooming peach trees. The Union assault began with a massive artillery barrage. 60 guns, every cannon Grant could bring forward, pounded the Confederate positions for 30 minutes. Shells exploded in the tree branches, showering defenders with wooden splinters that were as deadly as shrapnel. Solid shots smashed through tightly packed formations. Then the infantry advanced. Wave after wave of Union soldiers pushed through the orchard. The peach trees were in full bloom, and the ground was carpeted with pink and white petals. By the time the fighting ended, those petals would be soaked in blood. The Confederates fought with desperate courage. They knew this was their last stand. If the peach orchard fell, there was nothing between the Union Army and their line of retreat to Corinth. Regiments that had been reduced to a quarter strength refused to break. Officers who'd lost their entire staffs kept fighting. Men fired their last cartridges, then fixed bayonets and charged. But courage couldn't overcome numbers. By 2 p.m., Union forces had infiltrated the Confederate flanks. The defensive line was collapsing from the sides inward. Beauregard watched the position crumble and made his final decision that at 2:30 p.m., he ordered a general retreat. Confederate forces withdrew in reasonable order, considering the circumstances. Breckinridge's division and Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry formed a rear guard, fighting delaying actions to protect the main body. Confederate artillery, what was left of it, fired continuously to discourage Union pursuit. Grant wanted to chase the retreating Confederates, to turn their withdrawal into a rout. But his army was in no condition to pursue. His men had been fighting for 2 days. Casualties were staggering, over 13,000 killed and wounded. Units were scattered and disorganized. The horses needed for cavalry pursuit were exhausted or dead. Moreover, Grant himself was physically spent. His injured ankle had swollen so badly he could barely walk. Some accounts suggest he was nearly delirious from pain and exhaustion. Sherman urged caution. Let them go. We've done enough. By 4 p.m., the battlefield fell silent for the first time in nearly 48 hours. The Battle of Shiloh was over. The numbers tell the story of Shiloh's horror. Total casualties: 23,746 men killed, wounded, or missing. Union forces lost 13,047, 1,754 dead, 8,408 wounded, 2,885 missing. Confederate forces lost 10,699, 1,728 dead, 8,012 wounded, 959 missing. To put this in perspective, American casualties at Shiloh exceeded the combined losses from every previous American war: the Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, all of them together. And this was just one battle, in one sector, over 2 days. The wounded presented an immediate crisis. 16,000 men needed medical attention. The Union Medical Corps numbered fewer than 150 doctors. Confederate wounded numbered over 8,000, and many of them were left on the battlefield when Beauregard retreated. Union surgeons worked around the clock. Field hospitals were established in every standing structure: churches, farmhouses, barns. The log cabin that served as Shiloh Church became an operating theater. Limbs were amputated by the hundreds. Piles of severed arms and legs accumulated outside the hospitals. Anesthesia was administered when available, chloroform or ether, but supplies ran out quickly. Many men underwent amputation with nothing but whiskey and leather straps to bite down on. The mortality rate for amputations was approximately 30%, mostly from infection. Antibiotics didn't exist. Doctors didn't understand germ theory. They operated in the same blood-soaked clothing all day, spreading infection from patient to patient. Burial details worked for days. Thousands of bodies lay scattered across 10 square miles of forest and fields. The April heat accelerated decomposition. The smell became unbearable. Shallow mass graves were dug-long trenches, where bodies were laid side by side and covered with a few feet of dirt. Many dead were never identified. Dog tags didn't exist in 1862. Some soldiers carried identification in their pockets, but many didn't. Confederate dead were particularly hard to identify because their army had no formal system for recording casualties. Hundreds of families would never know what happened to their sons, brothers, and fathers. The political aftermath was equally significant. Northern newspapers initially celebrated Shiloh as a great victory. Headlines proclaimed, "Rebels routed," "Grant triumphant." But as casualty lists were published, the public mood changed. This wasn't the quick, glorious war everyone had expected. This was carnage on an industrial scale. Grant came under intense criticism. How could he have been caught by surprise? Why weren't defenses prepared? Rumors spread that Grant had been drunk, a slander that would follow him throughout the war, despite lack of evidence. Calls for his removal flooded Washington. Lincoln faced enormous pressure to fire Grant. His own Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, argued for Grant's dismissal. But Lincoln refused. According to accounts, when a delegation of politicians came to demand Grant's removal, Lincoln responded, "I can't spare this man. He fights." That simple statement encapsulated Grant's value. The Union had plenty of cautious generals who never lost battles because they never fought them. Grant fought. He took risks. He made mistakes. But he fought, and in the spring of 1862, that's what the Union needed. However, Lincoln did take action. He placed General Henry Halleck, Grant's superior and a notoriously cautious commander in direct command of the combined armies, at Pittsburgh Landing. Grant was technically demoted to second in command, a humiliating position for the man who just fought one of the war's bloodiest battles, for the Confederacy. Shiloh was a strategic disaster disguised as a tactical draw. They'd achieved surprise and nearly destroyed Grant's army, but they'd failed to capitalize on their success. Johnston's death deprived them of their most aggressive commander. The retreat left them no better positioned than before the battle, actually worse, given their casualties. More fundamentally, Shiloh demonstrated that the South couldn't win a war of attrition. The North had larger populations, more industry, more resources. The Confederate strategy had to be based on quick, decisive victories that would demoralize Northern voters and force a negotiated peace. Shiloh proved those quick victories weren't coming. This would be a long, grinding war. Both sides drew immediate tactical lessons from Shiloh. Field fortifications became standard practice. Never again would an army camp without digging entrenchments. Artillery tactics evolved based on the massive concentrations of fire that had proved effective. Medical services were expanded and improved, though they would remain horrifically inadequate by modern standards throughout the war. But perhaps the most important lesson was psychological. Shiloh shattered any remaining illusions about the war's nature. The romantic notions of gallant charges and heroic sacrifices gave way to a darker understanding. This was going to be brutal. It was going to be long. And it was going to demand a level of sacrifice that nobody in April 1862 fully comprehended. One Union soldier, writing home after the battle, captured the mood. The men who fought at Shiloh will never be the same. We went in as boys thinking war was glory. We came out as old men who know better. There is no glory here, only survival. Standing on the battlefield today, now preserved as Shiloh National Military Park, you can walk the same ground those men fought and died on. The sunken road is still there, worn down by time and footsteps. Shiloh Church has been rebuilt. Markers indicate where divisions camped, where they fought, where they fell. What strikes me most about Shiloh is how close it came to changing everything. If Johnston had attacked 6 hours earlier, if Beauregard had pressed the assault on the evening of April 6th, if Buell had arrived a day later, any of these variables could have resulted in the complete destruction of Grant's army. And without Grant, the Union's Western campaign might have collapsed. Vicksburg might never have fallen. The Mississippi River might have remained Confederate. The entire trajectory of the war could have changed, but history doesn't trade in what-ifs. What actually happened is that two armies clashed with unprecedented violence, learned painful lessons, and continued fighting for 3 more years. Shiloh was just the beginning. The battle teaches us several enduring lessons about leadership and warfare. First, never underestimate your enemy. Grant's assumption that Johnston wouldn't attack was based on logical analysis but ignored human psychology. Johnston's desperation, his fighting spirit, his willingness to take risks. Good intelligence matters, but understanding your opponent's character matters more. Second, junior officers and enlisted soldiers can change the outcome of battles when senior leadership fails. Prentice's stand at the Hornet's nest wasn't ordered by Grant. It was a desperate improvisation that bought crucial time. Sherman's refusal to break, despite repeated assaults, held the right flank together. These men made decisions in the moment that their commanders never could have anticipated. Third, logistics wins wars. The Union's ability to ferry Buell's army across the Tennessee River in darkness, under fire, in terrible weather, that operational achievement decided the battle as surely as any tactical maneuver. Wars aren't won by dramatic charges or clever tactics alone. They're won by the unglamorous work of getting the right forces to the right place at the right time. Finally, Shiloh teaches us about the resilience of human beings under extreme stress. Men fought for 2 days in rain and mud, watching friends die, enduring artillery bombardments that should have broken their spirits. They kept fighting not because they were superhuman, but because they were human, because they cared about their comrades, because they'd committed to a cause. Because giving up wasn't in their nature, the soldiers who fought at Shiloh deserve to be remembered not as statistics or tactical examples, but as individuals who faced unimaginable horror and persevered. They fought in a war we've spent 160 years trying to understand. Their sacrifice on both sides reminds us that democracy is fragile, that unity is hard-won, and that freedom has always required people willing to defend it. If you found this deep dive into Shiloh valuable, I encourage you to visit the battlefield if you can. Walk the sunken road, stand at Pittsburgh Landing, and imagine that desperate night. These places are part of our shared heritage, preserved so we can learn from them. And if you want more detailed explorations of Civil War battles, make sure to subscribe. We're going to examine Gettysburg, Antietam, Vicksburg, and others not as dry historical recitations, but as human stories of courage, failure, sacrifice, and redemption. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's continue exploring the moments that shaped America. Remember, as Lincoln said after the war, we must not be enemies, but friends. The men who fought at Shiloh, Union and Confederate, were all Americans. Their story is our story. Their lessons are our lessons. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.